Okay, colleagues, I think we'll make a start. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name's Darren Northcott. I'm the National Official for Education at the NASWT. And I was in the position that you are in, which is finishing your first year of teaching 29 years ago. Which is something of a sobering thought if you're me, but I thought it might be useful just in the time we've got this afternoon, just to talk a little bit about the next steps, if you like, in your induction, and maybe some reminders of one or two important points. So what I'll do is I'll start by sharing my screen. You bear with me. There we go. Let's find the right one. So there. Sorry, bear with me, colleagues. There. I'm just trying to share my screen. It's not. Let's try that. Yes. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. Let me just start the slideshow. Great, thank you. So yes, I thought we might do is just talk a little bit about year two of induction, and particularly the early career framework. And what I'll do is I'll just talk through a few issues around the ECF that might be of interest to you, and I'll talk a little bit about the issues that have been raised in the past by our members who are at the stage you have reached in your induction journeys. I'll also want to just recap some of your key rights and entitlements, and then perhaps just point out some of the sources of information, advice, and support that you can get from us as the NASUWT. If you've got any questions, I think the best thing to do will be to pop those in the Q&A. So there's the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you pop them in there, what I will do is I will then go through those questions and answer them as best I can. What I might do, if it's very specific, is I might direct you to some of our sources of advice and support. But if you've got any comments or observations or questions, then we'll do whatever we can to answer those. So let's think about the ECF, and it's worth just reflecting on the fact that the ECF is still relatively new. So it was introduced in 2021 in the middle of the pandemic, and it was the first substantial change to induction arrangements for 20 years. So before that, from 2001 to 2021, there'd been a fairly stable system around induction and induction support, which was changed in very, very challenging circumstances. So a few years have passed since the ECF has been introduced. And as we'll come on to, employers and schools have got used to the ECF. It was very new when it was introduced. They're more comfortable with it. But there's still some variability in the extent to which schools and employers are able to manage the ECF effectively. And you may well have experienced that. And that's especially true among those schools, and there are some, particularly small primary schools, that have only recently employed new teachers. So they suddenly have to get their heads around it. We've had members working in schools, as I say, particularly small primary schools, that may not have employed a new teacher since the ECF was introduced. They employ an ECT this year, and then they suddenly have to try and understand the ECF and how that all works. So it has improved, but it's still variable. And we've got some schools and employers that have been engaging with the ECF, but still aren't necessarily in the best possible place to make sure that you as new teachers and the mentors and other colleagues that you work with are getting the best out of induction. But it has improved a lot, and generally, as I'll come on to, the feedback has been positive, but there are some issues that I will talk about. Just one of the things just to note around the ECF, it hasn't been around for very long, as I say, since 2021, but it's being merged into the initial teacher training framework from next September. So that won't affect you, but the ECF and the ITT training frameworks are going to be combined into a single framework. That probably makes sense, and that is a response to some of the feedback that's been received around the ECF. But as I say, the situation has certainly improved since the ECF was first introduced. That doesn't mean there aren't some issues that we have to deal with. Just from our point of view, just to kind of emphasize, we've got a very long-standing view as a union that induction is a really important part of professional formation. It's a very important stage where the skills that have been developed in initial teacher training are then applied in a professional context. It isn't something to be got around if possible. It's something that everyone should benefit from. It should be seen as an advantage. That's why it's so important that employers and schools play their part in making sure that induction is a positive experience. It's also underpinned legally. So induction is something that schools that employ new teachers are legally required to offer and to make available. And there are also expectations, which I'll come on to, around what schools should be doing. These expectations, these requirements are not options for schools. They are things that schools must provide to new teachers. So those responsibilities that schools have and that appropriate bodies have are really important. There are some key documents. You're probably familiar with these, but if you're not, don't worry. But there are some key documents that shape the early career framework. We'll make sure this presentation is shared with you afterwards, but I've just listed some of the key documents here. There are hyperlinks there, so when you get the presentation, you can go forward and click on them. But there's our advice and guidance as well that summarizes the key points. But the key issue here is that the government sets out very clear expectations and requirements about how employers should act towards ECTs and how appropriate bodies should undertake their duties in monitoring the induction process for all ECTs and making sure that schools are doing what they are supposed to do. So how has the ECF been interpreted and experienced by new teachers? Well, there's, I think, one of the key things we've seen about the ECF, certainly since its introduction, is there are different ways in which schools could comply with the requirement to make sure that all new teachers have access to the ECF. There are some options available to schools where they could develop their own programs, their own training packages. But the DFE from the outset set out kind of, if you like, off the peg training packages and support packages for schools to use to make sure that the ECF was being complied with appropriately. And almost all schools use one of the off the peg ECF models. So there are 7 providers across the country. Not all providers offer their services to all schools, but there's a kind of off the peg model that almost all schools have used. I'm sure that nearly all of you, if not all of you, are in a school where you're doing your induction, where it's an external provider that is kind of leading that program. There are very, very few. That's really important because if we know that the majority or the vast majority of ECTs and schools are using those provider-led programs, then if there are problems with those programs, we are able to engage with the Department for Education and with the providers directly to address some of the problems, and there have been some that can arise. In terms of the feedback that we've had, is that there has certainly been positive feedback about all or part of the ECF from ECTs. So the DFE have done a series of evaluations of ECTs' experiences, and generally the feedback has been that it's positive. To some extent, from a school's perspective, they are comparing what we have now to what went before, and those schools often would say that there are many positives around the current model of induction compared to the historical one. So the feedback has generally been quite positive, and it's improved over time. So the extent of positive feedback has grown since the ECF was introduced. And where there are issues, and we know from the work that we do working with and supporting ECTs, there can be challenges and problems and issues and concerns around induction. That's the exception, not the rule, but that can happen, as you might expect. The kind of concerns that get raised about induction and about the way in which new teachers are being treated by their employer, to some extent, are issues that have been raised since induction first became a requirement back in 2001. So the concerns aren't necessarily around the ECF per se, always. They're particularly about the way in which employers make sure that ECTs are getting their entitlement. But the positive feedback generally has been quite positive, and the feedback that we get from our ECT members is also generally positive. But there certainly have been, and perhaps still are, problems that relate directly to the early career framework. And as I say, some of those have diminished or have reduced over time because this was a big change. And schools, as the years pass, get more used to the ECF and they get more used to how it should be managed. But there are still some issues, and those issues are still reported to us by our ECT members. We speak to the DFE a lot about this, and the DFE, to be fair, under the former government and under the current government as well, they recognise those concerns. So their analysis of the issues that have arisen probably aligns with ours, but obviously from the government's point of view, it's incumbent upon them to take action. They have taken action. They continue to promise to take action to address some of the concerns, but there are some issues. And I'll just summarize what those are. And it'll be interesting to hear, obviously, when we speak to the Department for Education about induction, we have much more credibility if we're reflecting the lived experience of ECTs working in our schools. And that's why feedback from ECTs, both yourselves and also those that have gone before you through induction under the ECF, it's very important that we get that feedback. It's really valuable because when we go and speak to the DFE, if we are reflecting the actual issues that ECTs are facing in schools, that gives us a lot more credibility, and it gives us much more ability to put right what needs putting right. But some of the concerns that we still pick up, and these were concerns when the ECF was first introduced, as I say, they've diminished, but they are still there. And the biggest concern perhaps has always been, and maybe still is around, if you like, the inflexibility of some of those provider-led programs. They seem very rigid, and our members who are mentors often report that what they would quite like to do is tailor the ECF to make sure that it's meeting the needs of individuals who are working as new teachers in their schools. But sometimes it seems extremely rigid. And one of the, I suppose, more common types of feedback that we get from ECT members is that sometimes it feels like you're jumping through hoops with the ECF. So you're experiencing and engaging with content that isn't necessarily the most useful to you in the circumstances in which you find yourself. So one of the issues for us continues to be making sure that there is much greater flexibility in the ECF to make sure that it meets individuals' needs, because it takes up a lot of time. We'll come on to that. It's important that if there's that investment of time, then the ECTs feel that that is worthwhile and is helping ECTs to develop their skills, knowledge, and expertise as qualified teachers. Another issue, again, this has been addressed to a significant extent, but it's not been entirely eradicated, is that some of our ECT members report that the content of the programs often feels like it's treading old ground from initial teacher training. So if you're engaging with the ECF, then it can feel as though all that's happening there is that content that you would have covered while you were in training, while you were working towards QTS, it's pretty indistinguishable from some elements of the ECF, and that isn't how the program should be. The program should help new teachers develop those skills that were established during initial teacher training, and sometimes there is a sense of treading over old ground from initial teacher training. The roots of that perhaps lie in what I said at the beginning, which is around when the ECF was introduced. And it was introduced during the pandemic when a lot of teacher training was disrupted for very understandable reasons. And that cohort of trainees who were doing their initial teacher training during the pandemic missed out a lot of content that they would otherwise have had. So there was a deliberate decision at the beginning of the ECF to try and make sure, reinforce some of those aspects of initial teacher training and reinforce those in the ECF. And to some extent, you can see why that was done. But I think you could say that that's kind of not necessarily as relevant today as it was back in 2021 and 2022. But the ECF hasn't changed enough to take account of the fact that new teachers coming through the system now didn't necessarily, there are still some, of course, but most didn't experience the degree of disruption that those trainees in 2020 and 2021 experienced. So it hasn't been revised to take account of those different circumstances. And that's why I think a lot of ECTs say that that is an issue with some of the providers, not necessarily all. Another issue, a kind of hangover, if you like, from the introduction of the ECF was that, against our advice, what the DfE did was it rolled out the ECF and it rolled out the mentor training at the same time. What would have made more sense would have been to have trained the mentors beforehand and then launched the ECF. So you had a lot of mentors who were trying to get their heads around the ECF, and they were trying to get their heads around the training that they had been receiving, and that created a lot of pressures and a lot of incoherence in the system. That, as you would expect, has kind of improved. So mentors who've been through that training and are still serving as mentors, they're more familiar with the ECF. But there are still some cases where, particularly for schools that haven't employed a new teacher for some time, or where the mentor has left, where the school is under a legal obligation to deliver induction, but the mentor who they've appointed hasn't completed all of that training. So what we want to see is a much better system of ensuring that mentors have the training before they support ECTs. So that's still an issue. Again, it's a kind of a hangover, if you like, from the way in which the ECF was introduced. It has got better, but the pressures that created on mentors, and it's important to remember, mentors are really important to your induction experience. Mentors are also our members, and they also have challenges that they face. It did put mentors under a lot of pressure. And we knew a lot of mentors, really good mentors, dropped out of undertaking that role because of the degree of pressure that they faced. Workload pressures, particularly around the accessing the ECF and the ECF materials, those were really significant. The position has improved. It was pretty serious in the first 1 or 2 years of the ECF, but it has improved. There were a lot of provider sessions that provided at weekends, during the holidays, and in the evenings. We still know that happens to an extent, but it doesn't happen to the same extent as it did previously. But it is unacceptable, and it is something that we continue to raise with the DfE and with the providers, is that the session should be within that school time, not tagged on to weekends, holidays, and in the evenings. And also that mentors don't get the time that they need to support their ECTs. So if a school employs new teachers, then it knows it has to provide a mentor, and there are expectations around how much time mentors should have in order to undertake those duties. And mentors don't always get the time they need to support their ECTs. And then if the mentors aren't getting the time, they're under pressure, but they're also not in a position to give new teachers the support to which they are entitled. So the ECF, if it's burdensome, if it's organized in a way that doesn't reflect the pressures that ECTs and all teachers face in respect of workload, it just adds workload burdens on top. It becomes unsustainable, it becomes unmanageable, and it undermines the quality of the induction experience. One issue around the ECF that we continue to press, but it still hasn't been addressed, is that there was no additional funding for the first year of induction. There is additional funding in year two that schools wouldn't have received otherwise, but for the fact that they have new teachers. That was to do with, without getting into the detail, that was to do with the extension of the induction period from 1 year to 2 years under the ECF, and some schools struggle to provide particularly mentor release time. That seems to be an issue that comes up a lot because they don't feel that they have the resources in order to fund that. They do have the resources for year two. They don't have additional funding for year one. The DfE said, well, you get funding anyway. So we'll only provide additional funding to take account of the extension of the induction period. And that has been an issue. So funding and making sure there are enough resources is an important point. There are genuine pressures that some schools face in respect of their ECTs. But the bottom line, and we have to be, I think, quite hard-headed about this, is that if a school chooses to employ new teachers and it employs new teachers for all kinds of reasons that are of benefit to itself, then it has to understand that it is taking on responsibilities and it has to ensure that it's got the resource to make sure that you get the time and facilities and support that you're entitled to, but mentors do as well. So we might be sympathetic to the financial circumstances of some schools, of course, but ultimately that can't be an excuse for not meeting the legal requirements under the ECF. So those are some of the kind of issues that we're continuing to work through, and they may reflect some of your experience as well. It'd be interesting to hear. But I thought what we might move on to now is just a reminder of some of the key rights and entitlements that you have as ECTs as your induction continues. And again, something we sometimes pick up, and this is perhaps a legacy of 20 years of a system where there was a 1 year induction period, not a 2 year induction period, is that sometimes schools can forget that an ECT in the second year is still an ECT and is still undertaking induction. So schools can sometimes forget. They shouldn't, but it's important to remember that induction is continuing in largely, not completely, but in largely the same way as it did before you move from year one to year two. So the fact that induction continues is really important. And your employer continues to have specific legal responsibilities to you because you have a special status as an ECT. It's really important to bear that in mind, and all the information, advice and support that we produce that's available on our website around ECTs, just to make the perhaps obvious but important point that those rights and entitlements continue as your induction continues. Just one thing to note is that there is the option in the induction regulations to end induction early, so before the process has been completed. And in some specific circumstances, that can be appropriate, but it's important to be cautious. So if you're thinking of trying to negotiate an early end to your induction, I would say you need to seek advice from us first. Or if it's suggested to you that induction should end early, then again, come and seek advice from us. That advice is confidential. We won't approach your employer or your school without your permission. But it'd be important to talk through the options, not least because if induction ends early, then essentially one of the things you're doing is handing over very important rights and entitlements you have as an ECT. So that's a big price to pay for ending induction early. That doesn't mean it isn't appropriate in some specific circumstances, but be really careful about that. We've come across schools that have kind of put pressure on ECTs to say, let's just end this induction, and let's just agree that you've completed your induction effectively, and then we'll move on, and you can continue as a post ECT teacher if you like. As I say, sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes that's driven by a kind of imperative related to funding and the management of the induction. It's not about the ECT's interests, it's more about the school's interests. So be very careful about that, and certainly seek advice from us before you enter into any agreement to end your induction early. You still have an entitlement to a reduction in your timetable teaching time. In the first year, that's 10%. That reduces to 5% in the second year. Some schools, they don't have to, but some schools are able to find enough resource to go beyond that 5%, but that's the minimum, 5%. If you have, if you're working in almost all state schools, certainly if you're working in a local authority maintained school that has PPA time or something equivalent to PPA time, the PPA time is in addition to your reduction in timetabled teaching time. And certainly, go back to what we said about the funding, while there wasn't additional funding for ECT induction in year one, there is specific dedicated additional funding for year two. So schools have additional funding to provide that time. So again, if you are concerned that you're not getting the reduction in timetable teaching time you are legally entitled to, very important to come and speak to us. The content of your induction is still based on the early career framework document. So nothing changes in that respect. You've got the documents I referred to earlier. Those guide and shape your induction experience under the ECF. And as I've said, we're continuing to engage with the DfE to address those delivery and organisation issues that I think members still sometimes encounter. Really important, and this is something we've picked up in one or two instances. Again, it's the exception, not the rule, but there seems to be a sense that in your second year of induction, the support from the designated mentor is not as important, so it can kind of tail off in some schools. That absolutely shouldn't happen. You're entitled to that support from your mentor in order to help you get the most out of your induction. As I discussed earlier, there are still issues around mentor support and mentor training. The general position continues to improve, but there shouldn't be any change in your entitlement to access mentor support just because you've moved from year one of induction to year two. Something that can get overlooked is, and you should all be obviously aware in your own schools of who your induction tutor is. The induction tutor and mentor roles are different. And I think the jury is still out on whether the decision that was taken 3 or 4 years ago, which was to split the mentor and tutor role, so the mentor may be focused more on coaching and support, the tutor more focused on assessment and taking an overall view of progress, whether that was the right thing to do or not. Beforehand, before the ECF was introduced, the mentor and the tutor used to be the same person, and there was quite a lively debate around whether splitting those two roles was the right thing to do or not. Generally, the feedback we've had is that that hasn't necessarily been a problem, but it is something where I think there's interest in whether that was the right decision or not, or whether the mentor and the tutor should be the same person. And reasonable minds took different views on whether that was a good decision or not. As I say, most of the feedback we get is that it's helpful that they are separate roles, or that it hasn't been a particular problem. But again, it's an area where I think feedback on experience would be very helpful. In some circumstances, particularly again in small schools, because it's difficult sometimes to find two separate people with the time to undertake both roles. the mentor and the tutor are sometimes the same person. That is permitted by exception, but those exceptions depend upon the circumstances and the staffing in the school. In almost all circumstances, the expectation is that the mentor and the tutor should be separate. A lot of focus on the mentor, really interested still in experiences around the tutor role as well, and whether that's working as a standalone role. You should be able to access pay progression. So in your schools, you'll have a pay range and you'll progress up that pay range. There shouldn't be any issues around you progressing up that pay range as you move from year one to year two. This was something of a controversy at the beginning of the early career framework and the extension of induction from 1 year for a full-time equivalent teacher to 2 years. We were very clear. The department's guidance is very clear as well, that there shouldn't be any reason why you shouldn't progress up the pay range as you move from year one to year two, because you've successfully completed year one. So therefore, you should be moving on to year two and moving up the pay range with no questions asked. Pay is really important, obviously, and pay can sometimes be a bit of a knotty issue in some circumstances. There are some complexities involved around pay and the arrangements around pay progression. You really should contact us if you have any concerns or any problems about whether you're being paid the right amount, particularly if there is a suggestion that you should continue with your induction, but you shouldn't get pay progression. One thing to note is that in England, and this is for schools, without going into the detail, but this is for schools covered by the School Teachers Pay and Conditions document. So that's a local authority maintained school. They're legally required to follow that. But the vast majority of academies and free schools tack quite closely to it. There was a requirement in that document that pay progression should be linked to the outcomes of performance management. You shouldn't be having performance management because you're doing induction instead. But there was a requirement there that it was the outcomes of the annual performance management, effectively whether you passed it or didn't pass it, that should decide whether you progress up the pay range. That requirement has been removed. It will still apply for pay decisions at the beginning of this year, but from here on in, those decisions do not have to be linked to the outcomes of performance management or appraisal. Our expectation is very clear that schools should set aside what is in effect performance related pay, and that pay progression up the pay range should be automatic. But that's quite a significant change that's been announced in the last few weeks. So that will be really important. But as far as you're concerned at the moment, there should be no issues around you getting pay progression as you move from year one to year two of your induction. And the appropriate body role, that's really important as well. As I said at the beginning, the appropriate body, I'm sure you're aware of who your appropriate body is. If you're not, it's really worth going to find out. The appropriate body has the legal responsibility to make sure that what should be happening is happening in respect of induction. That includes you getting your rights and entitlements. That includes mentors getting the support that's expected. If those things aren't in place and if there's an issue, it's the appropriate body that is supposed to intervene and is supposed to make sure that what's happening, what should be happening, is happening in practice. Bearing in mind that all these rights and entitlements that you have as ECTs are legal rights and entitlements. They're not optional extras. They're things you are legally entitled to, and the appropriate body's role is to monitor that appropriately. We have generally very good relationships with appropriate bodies. They've been established over quite some time. And often, if there is a problem, we're able to ensure that the appropriate body is an ally in addressing the problems that might be happening in a school. So it's always worth having a conversation with us, because we might, if you've got a problem, because we are often able to get the appropriate body to intervene because it has legal requirements and legal obligations to make sure that those legal entitlements are being met. So the appropriate body is really important. Be aware of who your appropriate body is, and they are often a good source of advice and information as well. but they can be really key if there are problems in getting those problems resolved. And then the final point, again, this comes up a lot, and the situation has improved, but there's still a bit of a misunderstanding around this, is that your assessment, so if we're thinking about induction, at the end of induction, the assessment is against the teacher standards. So it's the teacher standards that are used to decide whether an ECT has passed induction or not. And we make the point, and we'll make the point to the new government, that it doesn't make an awful lot of sense that the standards that you needed to reach in order to get QTS are exactly the same standards that you need to demonstrate you're meeting in order to pass your induction effectively. That doesn't make much sense. There should be different standards, but as it stands, they are the same standards for QTS and for passing induction. But as practicing teachers, what I think you're trying to do, and maybe the best way of understanding it, is to show that you can meet those same standards, but in a different context as professionally employed teachers. There's lots of advice and guidance. If you haven't looked at it, there's lots of advice and guidance on our website about how you can best ensure that you are demonstrating that you are meeting the teacher standards. Some ways in which schools organise that can be quite clunky, quite unwieldy. There's no need for a vast bureaucratic process. So do check out that advice and guidance on our website about the best ways in which you can demonstrate that you're meeting the teacher standards. But the point here, I suppose, is that if the teacher standards are the standards you have to meet in order to complete your induction successfully, it's not about passing the ECF. The ECF is a curriculum. It's not an assessment tool. So we've seen some schools using the ECF to construct almost parallel assessment procedures for ECTs. That isn't how the ECF should work. The ECF is around the experiences that you have, and the ECF is designed specifically to allow for assessment against the teacher standards at the end of your induction. So the ECF is not an assessment checklist. If there is an assessment checklist, it's the teacher standards. The ECF is about giving you the experiences that ensure that you can meet those standards at the end of your induction. And a really important principle around assessment in general is that no surprises. That's set out clearly in the guidance that schools receive, but you should be getting clear information about your progress. You should be given a clear assessment as to whether you are on track to meet those teacher standards and to pass induction at the end. And if there is a concern on the part of the school that they don't think you are going to meet those teacher standards, then they're under an obligation to give you that information as soon as they possibly can. And just to make, I think, a really important point, if you are concerned that you're working in a school that doesn't think you are on track to meet the teacher standards, or if it's raised concerns about any aspect of your performance, you must speak to us. It's really important that you have a conversation with us. Often we're able to reassure you about what's being said, but if we need to support you and provide representation, then we're able to do that. But it's really important, if you are concerned, and don't think that the concern are too unimportant or trivial. If you're concerned, then that matters to us. So it's really important you take advantage of the support that we offer to make sure that we can talk through your understanding of the situation in your school and make sure that we can advise you on the best next steps and represent you if that's necessary. Just again, emphasizing the point, we don't intervene, we don't contact your school, we don't contact your employer without your express permission and without having had a thorough conversation and an evaluation of the issues before doing so. But don't sit in worrying in silence. If you're concerned, that's what we're here for. Get in touch. And there are lots and lots of ways in which you can get information and support from us. There's lots of advice and guidance on the ECF on our website. Again, these are hyperlinks, so you can click through to that. you may be working in a school that has an NASWT representative in that school. It's worth finding out if you have an NASWT rep, because that person can provide really good advice and guidance on the particular circumstances in your school. They know that school, that's where they work, and they can give you that support. We have local associations. Those are the local kind of collectives of NHWT members, and they have people who conduct and undertake casework. And they're also good sources of advice and information as well. So your local association, if you haven't made contact with your local association, very, very strongly advise you to do so. Not just because it's a good source of advice, but it's also a really good way of meeting other teachers working in other schools in your locality. I always found that as a teacher really refreshing, because you can get a little bit locked into your school, your school's way of doing things, your school's way of marking, your school's way of behavior managing, your school's approach to behavior management, or the management of special educational needs, or whatever it is. And sometimes uh, meeting other teachers, and a local association is a really good way of doing that. You can kind of share experiences and understandings, and find out that actually there are schools that maybe do things in a different way. I always found that really, really helpful. And you have a national executive member as well. Every part of the country is divided into districts, and those have either one or two national executive members. They are elected by all the members in their district, and they have an important role as well. Again, if you're not sure who your national executive member is, you can find the information out easily on our website. And then we have the member support advice team. Those are very highly skilled and experienced professionals who are on hand to answer any queries that you might have about your induction or about your employment generally. It's linked to on the presentation, but the information is pretty easy to find on our website. You can email or you can telephone, but they are there to give you, they're that kind of first port of call. If you've got a problem or a concern, drop them an email or get in touch by telephone, and they will talk through whatever your issues are, what they might be, and what might be the best thing to do about them. All of those colleagues really have a firm grasp on induction and some of the issues that can arise. So they're a really good resource for you to draw upon. So those were the main points I wanted to make this afternoon. Let me just stop sharing my screen. And let's just have a look in the Q&A, see if we've got any questions. Yes, we've got a couple. We've got a question from Samara. Hello, Samara. And Samara asks, can my mentor change for the second year, and should they have started their training already? It's a really, really good point, because that can happen. The mentor can change, and there can be all kinds of good reasons why the mentor changes. The mentor might leave. So we've come across mentors who've retired or they've moved on and got another job. So they can change. That isn't necessarily a problem. Those mentors who leave need to be replaced by another mentor. What sensible schools do is they make sure they've got in place the arrangements for succession, if you like, if the mentors leave. Whether they should have started their training already is a good question. Ideally, they should have. But it doesn't necessarily matter if they haven't, because, as I said, during the first couple of years of the ECF, that was pretty much a universal experience. The key thing I think to look out for, though, is whether your mentor you think is getting the time that they need in order to do that job properly. Because what you're entitled to is support from that mentor. If they're not around to help you, then you're not getting what you're entitled to. They're also going to be under a lot of pressure as well. So what I think I would do in your circumstances is maybe go in with an assumption that the mentor will be able to do that job effectively. But if you're concerned about any aspect of the support that you receive from your mentor, particularly, as I say, can't stress this enough, the mentors are going to be busy because they're teachers, and all teachers are under pressure. Their mentors got to have the time to give you that support. That's the key thing to look out for. So if you don't think you're getting the time and support from your mentor, then what I think you need to do is get in touch with us, and we can talk through how that might best be addressed. So got another question here from Vicky. Good afternoon, Vicky. Is there any guidance on the number of full lesson observations ECT should have throughout the induction period? So you're saying you've been observed once for each half term during year one. It's a really good question. Um, our general position for teachers post-induction is that we would say that 3 observations lasting for no more than 3 hours in total is about the right amount, because to do an observation effectively actually requires a lot of work and a lot of input. So that seems to be the right amount. And schools, I think that's our expectation for post-induction teachers. However, we recognize that when you're going through your induction, when you're working towards meeting those teacher standards at the end of your induction, then it's perhaps helpful to have more constructive observation than that. There's nothing, however, written down, it's not carved in stone anywhere about how much is the right amount. But our rule of thumb would be for an ECT undertaking induction that 1 observation every half term, so say 6 throughout the course of an academic year, is probably about right. And you say that that's, I think you've been observed once each half term during year one. That's very, very typical. And that's generally what I think most schools do. More than that, it's difficult to manage for a mentor or for the head of department who's observing you. And also, more than that, is starting to turn not into supportive observation, but it looks more like monitoring and scrutiny. So that's a proportion. That's a kind of extent of observation that I think would be reasonable in most circumstances. But it does depend on the circumstances. And sometimes you as an ECT might want, let's say, a particular aspect of your practice to be the subject of a discussion between yourself and your mentor, and you can arrange additional observations if you think that's appropriate. But as far as the kind of core set of observations is concerned, that sounds about right, once every half term. Got a question here from Salma. Good afternoon, Salma. Are we allowed to be put on cover? We would say no. You're not. You should have you have a contractual entitlement. Certainly, if you work in a local authority maintained school, almost certainly, but check your contract. If you work in an academy or free school, that teachers should really be covering only rarely. So that might be an issue for all the teachers in your school. Cover is a poor use of a teacher's time. Certainly for a ECT, covering is not a very good way for ECTs to spend their time. If you're an ECT, you will know that what you really want to focus on is honing and developing your skills, and being asked to cover is not helping you to do that. So if you think that cover is an issue generally in your schools, if teachers generally are being asked to cover, including ECTs, then maybe that's something you might need to raise with us directly. And so you might want to talk through those circumstances with colleagues in the member support team. If there's a rep in the school, it might be worth talking about the general situation on cover. But certainly teachers who are covered by the school teachers paying conditions document, and most teachers are, there's a pretty strict provision in there around cover, because it's a poor use of any teacher's time, and it should only happen in exceptional circumstances. Question from Amy. Good afternoon, Amy. And you've got questions about pay progression. Are you not sure who to contact at the NSWT? I would say, if you're in doubt, contact the member support advice team. The details are available on our website. The details will also be in the hyperlink in the presentation that I'm going to forward to you. Have a discussion with them, but just bear in mind the issue I covered in the presentation, which is around there shouldn't be any barriers to pay progression, and the government are clear about this. Shouldn't be any barriers to pay progression just because you're an ECT and just because you are still undertaking induction. When you move from year one to year two, you should still get pay progression, because your performance, if your induction is continuing, your performance has been satisfactory, therefore there can be no reasonable grounds for denying you pay progression. But do get in touch with our member support advice team just to talk through that if you've got any problems. It's really important, particularly when it comes to pay, that we're making sure you're getting what you're entitled to. A question from Inma. Good afternoon, Inma. How do we know our timetable has been reduced by 5%? It's a really good question. It should be set out on your timetable at the start of the year. So if you think about how it was done for your 10%, then it should be the same, but it's just 5%. 5% of timetable teach time, and the calculation is sometimes it's slightly different from PPA time, but I'm not going to get into the details of that. Broadly, they're the same. But roughly speaking, what you should be getting is the equivalent of one. If you think about how that might best be organized, so you've got a working week, you've got 10 sessions, morning and afternoon, in that time. You should be getting the equivalent of one session every fortnight, because that would come to 5% of your timetable teaching time. There are different ways in which schools can organize that, so they don't have to provide it, strictly speaking, as one session per fortnight. They can organize it in different ways, but the kind of key expectation is the time you get should be meaningful. So it shouldn't be 5 minutes here, 10 minutes here. It should be set out clearly on your timetable. Again, a rough rule of thumb, very rough rule of thumb, is that for a block of time away from your class to be useful, it should be at least half an hour in length, because any less time than half an hour, by the time you've found somewhere quiet, you've unpacked your bag, turned your laptop on, and then turned your mind to whatever it was you were going to think about and do during that period, then the period of time is over. So it's got to be a meaningful, useful block of time. Most schools will identify a session, and they will say, well, that session is going to be your ECT time, your induction time. So hopefully that's helpful. A couple of other questions. Who's the right person to let us know about our targets? No one had told me about my targets until the last week of the academic year. Well, it depends on what they mean by targets, but essentially any objective you're working towards should be communicated to you at the beginning of the year. So at the beginning of the year, so if we think about, we tend to talk about objectives in performance management, not targets, because targets sometimes then turn into pupil performance target. X% of your pupils will achieve level X or standard Y at the end of the year. That's for all kinds of good reasons. That's not good practice. Government says that, not just us. But if you've got objectives that you're working towards, then those need to be set out at the beginning of the year. So as you're working through the year, you're aware of what they are, because they're not much use to you, as you say in your question. If you're given a target at the end of the period, you had to achieve the target. That doesn't sound very sensible. Whether ECTs and their reduction should be set targets at all is a good question. I think it depends upon what the objective or target is, but essentially you should know in good time, which is generally one academic year, what it is you're working towards. So you might want to have a think about that. And if you're working in a school where essentially you're being told that the target or the objective you have to reach, you're only being told that right at the end of, let's say, an academic year, then that's probably going to be a cause for concern, particularly if not meeting the target or the objective has consequences. So it's important that that's done properly. And again, if you're concerned about the consequences of these targets and maybe a sense that you might not have met them, that's what we're here for. Come and talk to us. We'll talk through how the land lies and what the best thing to do might be. And finally, a really, really good question here, which is a complex question, but should the pay progression start from September? And the answer is yes, it should, because it's done from at the beginning of the academic year. But one of the issues and this is not just ECTs, this is teachers generally, one of the issues that we've encountered, particularly under the last kind of 4 or 5 years of the government that's just left office, is that these matters were determined very, very late on. So we talk about, for example, pay progression and what the pay range should increase by, for example, um, then often schools weren't clear how much that should be because of delays as a result of the way in which the government manages this. They weren't clear about that until October and November. So sometimes pay increases weren't confirmed until October, November. However, there should always be a process of backdating. So what happens is that if, let's say, a change in the pay range is only confirmed in October or November, then the effective you should be given the money as though that had been announced in September. So there should be backdating. But yes, September is absolutely the key time. So pay works from September to September. And that's how pay progression is generally organized. But it can sometimes be that you don't get all that money until a few months into the term because of delays elsewhere. But in the end, you're not out of pocket because it's counted as though it were in place from the 1st of September. But it is a September to September process. There can be one or two exceptions to that, but I wouldn't worry about those too much. For the vast majority of teachers, it's September to September. So the beginning of September, pay progression, you move from, if your school organizes it this way, you move from M1 to M2, M2 to M3. That is effective from the 1st of September. Those are really good questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. And if you've got other questions, particularly questions about your own circumstances, as I say, if you're worried or concerned about anything, please do come and speak to us. And please do look at the advice and guidance we've got on our website. For some of the more straightforward issues, you can usually find the answer out really clearly just by having a look on there. But we are here to support you. That's what we're here for. And that's why we exist. And we have a lot of experience, a great deal of experience up and down the organization in making sure that you as ECTs get what you are entitled to. It's getting close to the end of the summer holiday, but maybe technically there's a little bit of it left. If there is a little bit left for you, do enjoy it. Enjoy the second year of your induction. Make sure you're insisting upon getting all of your entitlements. And if you're not, come and see us and we will give you the support that you need. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Keep in touch with us, and I hope at some point to see you all in person at one of our events, details of which will be on our website. Take care of yourselves and look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.